Samir Gandesha. He is from Department of Humanities, Simon Fraser University. He will talk about GharWapsi, conversion, and the Neoliberal Politics of Debt. And I'm surprised at how all of this he can incorporate in 15 minutes. Let's see.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Whether I can encompass all of this even in 20 minutes is going to be, I think, an interesting question. I have to really state from the outset that I really am about to do something very foolish, which is to speak about something that I'm not an expert in. I was invited to participate in a book project to contribute a chapter to this question of GharWapsi, and I took it on for a number of reasons. I found the question extremely interesting intrinsically, but also I am very interested in my other work with the concept of home and how it figures in thinkers like Martin Heidegger, Hegel, Adorno, and Hannah Arendt. So I thought there was some nice overlap in the concerns there. So what this paper really represents is the articulation of some intuitions about the phenomenon. So I'm very interested and would very much welcome your comments and criticisms as well, so I can make it a better contribution. So this is the chapter is much longer than I'm going to be able to actually present, but I'll just say how it's set up. First of all, I have an epigram from Adorno, and it reads in the following way: there is no longer any homeland other than a world in which no one would be cast out anymore, the world of a genuinely emancipated humanity. And I start out by, in a sense, situating the question very much in terms of what's been described as a shift from a kind of democratic, nominally democratic form of neoliberalism to an authoritarian form. And I'm drawing on the work of Maurizio Lazzarato in particular, who was writing in the context of the Greek experience, and indeed the experience of Southern Europe as a whole, and the way in which, within the context of the European Union, democratic structures and institutions are really, in a sense, sidelined when it comes to the question of debt and what you could call the dictatorship of finance. So I then sketch how the global phenomenon of authoritarianism might enable us to situate some of the developments in India, and then try and situate this problem of GharWapsi, or homecoming, within that context. So this is essentially where I'll start the presentation. So, like American neoconservatism, Hindutva could be seen as appropriating aspects of a left anti-colonial politics for what is ultimately a deeply reactionary agenda. Incidentally, this is brought home by the fact that militant Hindus, both within India as well as in the United States, have thrown considerable support behind the Islamophobic and exclusionary politics of Donald Trump. And I should say the ultimately successful politics of Donald Trump. This was written before his election as the 45th President of the United States. This must appear as especially cynical because, as ANU historian Mridula Mukherjee has shown, not only were Hindutva organizations not involved in the Quit India movement, they often sided directly with the British. In the case of BJP, such a rhetorical appropriation of certain aspects of left politics has to do with an anti-colonial rhetoric of a certain sort that has gone hand in hand with the persecution of minorities, Muslim and to a lesser extent Christian minorities, as part and parcel of reimagining the nation as identical with an erstwhile humiliated, downtrodden Hinduism. Such a narrative of the domination of the Hindu nation, first by Mughal invaders from the north in the 17th century, and then later by the Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries. The parallel with the post-War I claim that Germany had been betrayed by its political leaders in the humiliation of Versailles is indeed quite striking. Indeed, before the election, as Pankaj Mishra has recently pointed out in a comprehensive and insightful piece in the New York Times, Hindutva projected a sense of long-time Hindu victimization, suffering, and subordination to colonial rule, as previously suggested. Mishra states, and I quote, "Certainly the ruling classes of wannabe superpowers have spawned a complex force, the ideology of anti-imperialist imperialism, which forms an axis with the modern state and media and nuclear technology, can make Islamic fundamentalists seem toothless. One can only hope that India's democratic institutions are strong enough to constrain yet another wounded elite from breaking out for geopolitical and military manhood." I think words that I think in this context in the last 3 or 4 weeks ring particularly true. However much Hindutva may wish to present such a picture of victimization, or what psychoanalysis would call a form of paranoid projection, whereby the aggressor construes himself as a victim, insofar as it suits its present political agenda, the historical record is much more complex. Christians have been on the subcontinent since at least the 2nd century BCE, from the small colonies on the southwest coast, Goa and Kochi, established by the Portuguese, and in the areas surrounding Chennai, such as Pondicherry, settled by the French traders. The British didn't allow missionaries into the subcontinent until the 3rd decade of the 19th century. Nevertheless, one could argue that this narrative plays a key legitimizing role today for Hindutva in general, and the BJP in particular. So an important dimension of the anti-colonial agenda, defined not in structural terms, but in explicitly cultural ones, has been the controversial project led by the RSS and other fundamentalist organizations to convert or reconvert Hindus who were once the targets of proselytizing Abrahamic religions as part and parcel of a process of colonization. In other words, the politics of Hindutva can be understood as a species of identity politics, where the agent of politics is not understood in terms of socioeconomic class or caste, but rather in cultural or linguistic terms. As Fanon had argued in the context of African liberation struggles, such a definition of political agency opens the door to the substitution of the native post-colonial for the European colonial elites. Critics of the practice refer to it as conversion, while advocates consider it to be simply a process of reconversion, or of bringing wayward Hindus back into the fold. In other words, advocates of the practice refer to it as GharWapsi, or homecoming. My interest in this essay is simply to attempt to clarify the semantic distinction. Critics of the practice of conversion claim that it entails either duress or conversion, or a kind of bribery, and this is itself consistent with the pronouncements of some senior Hindu priests who emphasize the manner in which there's really no place for those of other faiths, particularly Islam and Christianity in India. They must either convert or subordinate themselves totally and inexorably to the Hindu nation. The equation here, as alluded to above, is of India with Hinduism as such. The myth of India as the land of the Hindus, or Hindustan, although that is a particular interpretation of what Hindustan originally meant. This is a clear case of a monolithic account of the good life, or what Rawls would call a comprehensive doctrine, being placed above right, or the procedures by which competing accounts of the good life could be said to mutually coexist by forming an overlapping consensus or agreement on the fundamental principles of public life that may, for example, be taken to be embodied in the Constitution, amongst other things, to which citizens of all faiths and creeds could commit themselves. Arguably, in a pluralistic democracy, the good, stipulating, for example, restrictive food practices, such as a prohibition on the consumption of beef, can only take precedence on the basis of discrimination against minorities who simply do not share such an account of it. For its defenders, many of whom eschew the term conversion, and indeed, and rather favor formal, and indeed favor formal legal restrictions on the practice, such as I believe Modi himself had done as Chief Minister of Gujarat, the phenomenon is referred to as a form of genuine homecoming, GharWapsi, or the return to the Hindu family, and therefore to an authentic Indian identity. What is suggested here, in fact, is an absence of duress or coercion, but rather a kind of hospitality and welcoming, for it is precisely by way of such a putative homecoming that one could be said to overcome the conditions of one's own estrangement, even, of course, if one isn't aware of it. In the language of Hannah Arendt, in the language that Hannah Arendt uses in her penetrating biography of Rahel Varnhagen, homecoming is the way in which the individual becomes transformed from a social pariah to a parvenu, from a stigmatized other to an assimilated insider. However, rather than, as was the case with Varnhagen, who was a Jewess assimilating to a predominantly Lutheran society in post-revolutionary Berlin, Indian Muslims and Christians, at least according to Hindutva, were returning to their own authentic community after spending time, possibly like many Hindu deities, saints and yogis, in the metaphysical wilderness. In this register, it might be strangely and counterintuitively understood as very much in line with the kind of putatively anti-imperialist rhetoric mentioned above, that after centuries of Mughal and British rule, under which Hindus themselves were compelled to convert to the dominant Islamic and Christian alien powers, now India awakens as a Paka, or genuine Hindu nation. In the process, it addresses its post-colonial legacy by breaking with socialism and its ties with the now-defunct Eastern Bloc. It engages in an aggressive process of modernization and liberalization, which has driven the dramatic rates of growth witnessed over the past 2 decades, whose epicenter has been, at least so the story goes, Modi's Gujarat, the so-called Gujarat model. Yet, as has been pointed out, such rates of growth centering on resource extraction, cheap labor, and foreign capital inflows, rather than high labor productivity and technological innovation, have left virtually untouched India's shameful ratios that 43% of Indian children below the age of 5 are undernourished and 48% stunted. Nearly half of Indian women of childbearing age are anemic. It is finally a position, therefore, to cast off the oppressor's alien spiritual and religious chains. The idea of homecoming suggests the idea of return from a condition of exile, estrangement, and alienation to one of belonging, flourishing, and a fulfilled life. At first glance, it would seem that the idea of forced conversion on the one hand and GharWapsi could not be further apart. While the former denotes coercion and duress, the latter seems to suggest a journey that could be said to entail a learning process, indeed the attainment of a certain kind of self-knowledge, or even enlightenment. The question I pose then, is it possible to justify such a distinction? So the paper then goes on to discuss the whole of the idea of homecoming has within the Western tradition, from the Odyssey through Hegel to Novalis, who defined philosophy as a desire to be everywhere at home in the world. And such a notion in the Western context entails what Hegel calls the identity of identity and non-identity, and the subordination of the latter. I also discuss this in comparative perspective with the Ramayana, where the idea of homecoming is really articulated fully, and the notion of exile plays a particularly important role. So, GharWapsi in the contemporary period cannot be understood without reference to the Ramayana, to which it could be argued it implicitly and explosively points. One that since the 1980s has become, moreover, part of the filmic imagination of India in the popularizing made-for-television drama. GharWapsi refers to Ram's return home from his sojourn in the forest with Visvamitra, and also foreshadows his ultimate return home as Vishnu to his rightful place in the heavens alongside of his bride Sita. The GharWapsi of wayward and benighted Christians and Muslims evokes Rama's own mythical GharWapsi to Ayodhya. In fact, it could be said to repeat such a homecoming. Advocates of the practice could then claim that it honors in the most profound manner those to whom it welcomes home. If we understand GharWapsi in these terms, in terms of a less than innocent homecoming, a homecoming as a negation that entails the incorporation of the alien other, then the distance between the two understandings of conversion is perhaps not so great as would initially appear. If in the West the primordial text of its own self-understanding fundamentally addresses the problem of return home to Nostos, the Odyssey, which concerns itself with Odysseus' 10-year journey home after the Trojan War, yet, as Horkheimer and Adorno famously argue in Dialectic of Enlightenment, this homecoming, far from being innocent, when culminating in meaning and fulfillment, entails a terrible, brutal violence. It does so in two distinct ways. First, in order to survive a menacing external nature as symbolized by the various dangers he confronts in the Cyclops, the Sirens, Lotus Eaters, Scylla and Charybdis, etc., Odysseus, in order to survive, must turn the prospect of that very violence against himself and against his own men through the imposition of the ascetic ideals. Rather than propitiating the gods from without by a sacrificial offering, Odysseus does the work of enlightenment, rationalization, by internalizing such sacrifice, by renouncing the impulse to enjoyment, as is so stunningly exemplified by the Sirens episode. Oh. He does not work and can enjoy, albeit repressively, the aesthetic pleasure. The men, however, in order to work, must be denied such pleasure. Secondly, upon returning home, the aggression that builds up by virtue of precisely such an introverted sacrifice is visited with terrifying force on the suitors and the maids who have been seduced by them, who have taken over Odysseus' Ithaca home and eat and drink fully of his substance. The 12 of 50 maids of Odysseus' household who consorted with the suitors are forced to clean up the blood and gore that Odysseus, Telemachus, and their men leave in the wake of the settling of the scores with the suitors. They are later taken outside and hung. That's kind of my conclusion. The opposition between GharWapsi and the forced coercion cannot be maintained because the very notion of homecoming itself conceals a hidden violence. With the attempt to reclaim the site at the Babri Masjid, such violence bursts to the surface and becomes open for all to see. But the question then arises as to why the rhetoric of GharWapsi now, at this historical moment. As suggested at the outset in the passage from the democratic to authoritarian phase of neoliberalism, as Lazaratto has suggested, such a transition corresponds from a shift of the governance of institutions of the state to a form of governance by debt. It entails what he calls the making of indebted man. And indeed, indebted man is responsible as an individual for his debt and is therefore constituted by guilt. So important is this transition that Lazaratto makes a rather startling claim that the capital wage-labor relation has given way to the relationship between the creditor and the debtor. What could be the possible relation to GharWapsi? One may speculate that for Modi's neoliberal project, GharWapsi can play a key role in bringing Hindus back into the fold, not simply for religious and cultural reasons, but also for socioeconomic ones. As both Weber and Walter Benjamin insisted, one must not discount the economically rational role for religion itself, and not just Puritanism. The putative return home of wayward Christians and Muslims to Hinduism isn't simply part of a bulwark against a supposed Islamic threat, both from without as well as from within, but can also be regarded as a reinscription into a distinctive economy of spiritual debt or dharma, of doing the work to which one is assigned. If the politics of debt lie at the heart of an authoritarian turn of neoliberalism, and if the universalizing pretensions of globalization are always articulated in local and regional conditions, then in India such an authoritarian turn bears at least in part the name GharWapsi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gandesha. My next speaker is Shada Barab. He is an assistant professor with Tata Institute of